Welcome, dear subscribers and curious listeners of my channel. Hermione Granger is a symbol of knowledge, determination, and loyalty. More than once, she saved her friends thanks to her plans and her ability to think clearly in a crisis. But even the brightest minds make mistakes. In her story, there are moments when her decisions could have turned into a real catastrophe, not only for her, but for the entire wizarding world. From ill-considered actions to emotional outbursts, let's look at the situations where Hermione clearly miscalculated. Enjoy the video. Number 1. The cat hair. In the Chamber of Secrets, Hermione showed that even the most level-headed student is capable of taking a risky step. She used a hair she found on her robe, assuming it belonged to Millicent Bulstrode, but it turned out to be a cat hair, which led to extremely unpleasant consequences. It's strange that such a clever witch didn't confirm the source of the strand before brewing Polyjuice Potion. This incident became a clear example of how overestimating one's attentiveness can come at a high cost. Number 2. Displaying Dumbledore's army list for all to see. During Umbridge's regime at Hogwarts, Hermione helped create Dumbledore's army, enchanting the members list so that any traitor would be punished. But she made a serious mistake. The list was kept somewhere accessible. As a result, it fell into Umbridge's hands and every member found themselves in danger. Considering her usual caution, this blunder is particularly surprising. Number 3. Not believing Harry's theory about Malfoy. In The Half-Blood Prince, Harry suspected that Draco Malfoy had become a Death Eater after his father's failure. He noticed strange behavior from Draco and was certain he'd seen the dark mark. But Hermione brushed off this theory, didn't try to check the facts, and didn't support her friend. In the end, Malfoy's plan to let Death Eaters into Hogwarts succeeded. Perhaps Hermione's help could have changed the outcome. Number 4. Gilderoy Lockhart. Infatuation spares no one, not even the most rational minds. Like many students, Hermione fell under the charm of the new Defense Against the Dark Arts professor, Gilderoy Lockhart. Although the signs of his complete incompetence were obvious, she defended his reputation for a long time and was only disappointed when the deceit could no longer be hidden. For someone skilled at seeing through appearances, this was an unexpected mistake. Number 5. First impressions. From her first days at Hogwarts, Hermione strove to display her knowledge and skills, but her excessive self-confidence worked against her. To Harry and Ron, she came across as a know-it-all, never missing a chance to emphasize her superiority. This explains why, at first, they were rather cold toward her. Sometimes the desire to showcase one's intelligence can get in the way of forming friendships. Number 6. Cormac McLaggen. When Ron began dating Lavender Brown, Hermione, wanting to get under his skin, decided to take Cormac McLaggen to the Christmas party. Logic would have suggested this was unlikely to work. She had no feelings for him, and Ron was already involved in another relationship. This move was driven by emotion, not reason, and, as one might guess, it didn't produce the desired effect. Number 7. Using the time turner. Upon receiving the time turner, Hermione decided to use it to attend every class that interested her. But this led to burnout, constant stress, and, in a sense, accelerated aging. She lived more hours in a day than others. She also kept her discovery secret, even from close friends, which could have stirred unnecessary suspicion. The danger of theft or exposure was far too great to ignore. Number 8. Obliviating her parents. In the quiet of her parents' living room, Hermione pointed her wand at the people who had raised her. "Obliviate," she whispered, erasing every trace of herself from their minds. Wendell and Monica Wilkins, no longer Mr. and Mrs. Granger, smiled faintly, unaware their daughter had ever existed. She planted new memories, a new life, and sent them to Australia. The intention was pure, protect them from Voldemort's war. But the cost was unbearable. They had lost their child without knowing it. Yes, Hermione believed she could restore their memories after the danger passed, but there were no guarantees. If she fell in battle, the spell would remain forever. The risk of irreversibility, the trauma of identity loss, the silence she kept from her friends. It was a decision so severe that even someone as methodical as Hermione stepped into moral shadow. In saving them, she had also taken something from them that no magic could truly repay. Number 9. Freedom on Schedule, her campaign for house elf rights. Hermione's Society for the Promotion of Elfish Welfare began with the best of intentions. She knitted tiny hats and socks, leaving them around Gryffindor Tower, convinced that the house elves would find them, take them, and be freed. "They'll thank me one day," she insisted to Harry and Ron. But the elves didn't see the gifts as blessings. Most avoided the tower entirely, fearing they might accidentally pick up clothes and be dismissed from work they valued. Only Dobby, the free elf, accepted her offerings, proudly wearing mismatched socks and hats at once. The others, Winky, Creature, and the rest, saw her actions as intrusive, even disrespectful. To them, service was not slavery but tradition, bound by loyalty and pride. Hermione, certain she knew what was best, never stopped to ask how they felt about freedom. Her campaign, meant to uplift, ended up alienating those she wanted to help. It was a rare case where Hermione's brilliant logic failed her. She had fought for justice, but without listening to the voices of the very people she claimed to represent. The result was frustration, misunderstanding, and a lonely pile of untouched woolen hats. Symbols not of liberation, but of a well-meant plan gone wrong. Number 10. Confundus at the Quidditch tryouts. The Quidditch tryouts were tense that morning. Cormac McLaggen, tall and confident, was catching every quaffle with ease. Ron Weasley stood nearby, gripping his broom tightly, the weight of expectation heavy on his shoulders. Hermione Granger watched from the stands, her eyes fixed on Ron. When Cormac soared up for the final save, she made her decision. With a discreet flick of her wand, she whispered, "Confundo." Cormac's eyes glazed for a split second. The quaffle slipped through his hands, thudding into the goal hoop. The crowd gasped. "That's it," called Harry, announcing Ron as the new keeper. Ron was beaming, but Hermione kept her expression carefully neutral. She had helped him win, but the victory wasn't clean. The magic had been subtle, almost invisible, but she knew what she'd done. Hermione had always been the voice of fairness. She had scolded others for cheating, for bending the rules. Yet here, her loyalty to Ron outweighed her principles. It was a small spell in a small moment, but it crossed a line she herself had drawn. Ron got his place on the team, but the cost was a secret that didn't belong on a Quidditch pitch. Number 11, Harry's Firebolt and the Trust Issue. When Harry Potter received a Firebolt for Christmas, it was the finest broomstick money could buy. Sleek, fast, and almost impossible to get, the gift was anonymous, which only added to its mystery. Harry's eyes lit up the moment he saw it. But Hermione Granger didn't see speed or prestige. She saw danger. With Sirius Black still at large, she suspected the broom could be cursed. Without telling Harry, Hermione went straight to Professor McGonagall. "It's for his own safety," she told herself, explaining her concern that the broom might carry a hidden hex. McGonagall agreed, and the firebolt was confiscated for inspection. When Harry found out, his face darkened. "You did what?" he demanded. Ron stood beside him, equally stunned. For them, it wasn't just about the broom. It was about trust. Hermione tried to defend her choice, insisting she only wanted to protect Harry, but the way she had gone about it left no room for discussion, no chance for Harry to be part of the decision. The broom was gone for weeks, and the silence between the three friends was heavy. Every time they passed each other in the common room, the air was thick with unspoken words. In the end, the broom was cleared of any curses. It was safe. But the damage to their friendship lingered. Hermione had been right to think of the risks, but she had misjudged the importance of how she acted on them. Sometimes, even when your intentions are good, The path you choose can hurt more than the danger you're trying to prevent. Number 12. Rita Skeeter. Trap and blackmail. Rita Skeeter had made a career out of twisting words into poison. During the Triwizard Tournament, her quill dripped with lies about Harry Potter, Hermione Granger, and anyone else who made for good scandal. But Hermione had watched, listened, and noticed something strange. Rita always seemed to vanish when the moment demanded. It wasn't disapparition, it was something else. Then came the discovery. Rita was an unregistered animagus, able to transform into a beetle and eavesdrop unnoticed. Hermione caught her during one of these spying missions, trapping the beetle in a glass jar. "You're going to keep your quill to yourself, or I'll tell the Ministry," Hermione warned, her voice steady. Rita buzzed angrily inside the jar, powerless. It was blackmail, plain and simple. Hermione justified it in her mind. Rita had hurt too many people, and the truth about Voldemort's return needed to be heard without her interference. Still, there was a flicker of unease. This was not how she usually fought battles. The plan worked. With Rita silenced, Hermione convinced her to write the real story about Harry's encounter with Voldemort in the graveyard. The article appeared in the Quibbler, bypassing the Daily Prophet's smear campaign. It was a victory. Students whispered, the Order took heart, and Harry's version of events finally reached those willing to believe. But beneath the triumph, Hermione knew the means she had used would never pass her own moral tests. For all her lectures about fairness and rules, here she had crossed into a grey zone. She had forced Rita's hand, using a secret against her, the same kind of tactic she despised in others. It was the paradox of war. To fight dirty players, Hermione had dirtied her own hands. And while she never spoke of it openly, the glass jar with the beetle became a quiet reminder that even the brightest witch of her age could choose a shadowed path when the stakes were high enough. Number 13. Disguising as Bellatrix and the Gringotts break-in. The break-in at Gringotts was never going to be easy, but on paper the plan had a spark of brilliance. Hermione Granger would take Polyjuice Potion and transform into Bellatrix Lestrange, using the Death Eater's feared reputation to intimidate anyone who stood in their way. "You look a lot better as yourself," Ron had joked when the transformation was complete. But the truth was, the disguise demanded more than just Bellatrix's face. It demanded her voice, her arrogance, her dangerous unpredictability, and that was where cracks began to show. From the moment they entered the marble hall, the goblins were suspicious. Hermione's stiff walk, the hesitation in her speech, the way she clutched Bellatrix's wand as if it might explode, every detail betrayed the act. Bograd, the goblin escort, kept glancing up at her, his sharp eyes narrowing. "Madame Lestrange," he said slowly, "perhaps you will provide your wand for identification." It was a test, and she stumbled. The goblins noticed. Goblins always notice. The descent into the vaults became a series of small mistakes that snowballed. The thief's downfall washed away the effects of the Polyjuice Potion, leaving Hermione's true face exposed. Bogrod's shocked gasp echoed in the dark tunnels, and in the next breath alarms began to ring. The vault's defences came alive, multiplying treasure, burning hot to the touch, and in the chaos Harry seized the Hufflepuff cup. It was their prize, but the cost was rising by the second. The escape was desperate. They mounted the blind chained dragon guarding the deepest vaults, clinging to its back as it crashed through the white marble ceiling. Sunlight exploded into the darkness, and the roar of the beast drowned out everything else. They had the Horcrux, yes, but they had also shattered any remaining trust between wizards and goblins. Hermione's gamble had worked, barely, but it was the kind of reckless improvisation that could have ended not with a dragon's flight, but in the cold, iron cells of Gringotts. Number 14. Hitting Gregory Goyle at the Dueling Club. The first meeting of the Dueling Club at Hogwarts was meant to be exciting. maybe even a bit of harmless fun. But excitement quickly tipped into chaos. Spells were flying from every direction, students shouting, wands flashing in the candlelight. In the middle of it all, Hermione Granger stood near Harry Potter and Ron Weasley, her eyes darting from duel to duel. It wasn't supposed to get dangerous, yet, as the tension rose, Hermione acted on instinct. She raised her wand, muttered a quick incantation, and a jet of light shot across the room. She had aimed at the chaos, hoping to diffuse it. But magic in a crowded space has its own will. The spell struck Gregory Goyle squarely in the shoulder. "Oi!" he bellowed, stumbling back into another pair of dueling students. Wands clattered to the floor, and for a second the whole scene froze. Hermione's face tightened. She had not meant to hit him, but the damage was done. Goyle, never one to back down, turned with a glare that could curdle milk. He wasn't seriously hurt, but the blast had been enough to knock him off balance. In the confusion, Professor Lockhart was still waving his wand uselessly, shouting, "Just like this, everyone," as if the chaos was part of the demonstration. Somewhere behind the crowd, Draco Malfoy laughed, and Harry shot Hermione a look, half surprise, half warning. "That was close," he muttered under his breath. In truth, Hermione had let the moment carry her. She wasn't usually careless, but the Dueling Club was a lesson in how quickly control can slip. Even a witch as talented as Hermione could be caught in the current of noise and light, acting before she thought. The spell could have been worse, far worse, and in that sense, Goyle had been lucky. Yet it was a reminder that in magic, as in life, precision matters as much as power. Number 15, destroying a dragon's tooth in the Deathly Hallows. The air in the Chamber of Secrets was heavy with the acrid scent of dragon venom, a stench that burned in the nostrils and clung to the skin like a curse. Hermione Granger, her hands shaking and her robes streaked with grime, held in her grasp one of the most fearsome and rare weapons known to the magical world, a dragon's fang ripped from the shattered mouth of the great basilisk Harry had slain years before. The venom still glistened on the ivory surface, smoking faintly where it touched the stone floor. It was a relic of raw, lethal power, something only the most dangerous of magical creatures could provide. In that moment, the world above them was collapsing into chaos, and her mind raced through calculations of risk and necessity. She acted quickly, almost instinctively, to rid herself of the fang once it had served its immediate purpose. The trio had known the value of basilisk venom from the moment Harry destroyed Tom Riddle's diary in their second year. Back then they had been children standing on the fringes of a great war they barely understood. Now, years later, they were in the heart of it, and venom from a creature as ancient and deadly as a basilisk could cut through the near-impervious protections of a Horcrux. That knowledge had carried them into the depths of Hogwarts, where Hermione had seized the fang and driven it into Hufflepuff's cup with the precision of a surgeon and the fury of a soldier. There was a sound like a scream of pain, Rowling wrote, and a gush of black blood spurted from the pipe. Cup. The Horcrux was gone, and for a moment so too was the crushing weight of their mission. Yet almost as soon as it was over, the decision was made. The fang, bloodied and potent, was discarded. Whether tossed aside in exhaustion or left behind in the urgency to move on, the result was the same. In that act, small and fleeting in the madness of battle, was a choice that could have altered the tools they carried into the final stages of the hunt. Dragon fangs and basilisk venom were impossibly rare. Even the most skilled alchemists in the world would balk at the thought of acquiring such a substance. To have one in their possession was to hold a sliver of unmatched magical potency. But Hermione's mind, so sharp and deliberate in planning, fell prey to the pressing demand of the moment. Hermione was no stranger to calculated risk. She had smuggled Polyjuice Potion into Hogwarts at the age of 12, led a daring escape from the Ministry under the eyes of Death Eaters, and erased her parents' memories to protect them. She was a strategist who weighed options with cold logic. And yet, here in the bowels of the school, under the flickering light of Harry's wand, her choice seemed to abandon all her usual layers of consideration. She destroyed the Horcrux and let the weapon go, as if its value expired the instant its immediate use was fulfilled. The flaw was not in her courage, but in the narrowness of her vision under stress. For in the escalating chaos of the Second Wizarding War, magical resources were not luxuries, they were lifelines. A dragon's fang, steeped in venom potent enough to destroy Horcruxes, was a weapon that could render even the most cursed objects vulnerable. Think of the days that followed, when the trio faced the final Horcruxes without certainty of how to destroy them. They relied on the sword of Gryffindor, imbued with basilisk venom years before, but its location was precarious, its recovery a matter of chance. Had the fang been kept, it could have stood as a second safeguard, a means of ensuring that no Horcrux remained beyond their reach. It is worth remembering that not all magical tools are interchangeable. A wand may channel spells, but venom has no substitute when it comes to penetrating certain dark enchantments. The destruction of a Horcrux is not a matter of brute force. It requires a magical agent so toxic, so antithetical to the fragment of soul it contains, that it leaves no possibility of recovery. Nothing could repair it, Dumbledore had once said of the diary pierced by the basilisk fang. This is why the weapon in Hermione's hand that day was irreplaceable. A moment's pause to store it, to protect it from the battle's chaos, might have spared them from future uncertainty. Instead, the decision vanished into the whirl of movement. Harry was already running toward Ron, the echoes of Voldemort's rage trembling through the castle walls. Time was a predator nipping at their heels, and Hermione's mind leapt to the next danger, the next sprint, the next desperate act. In the language of war, it was a tactical move to focus forward. In the language of resource management, it was a loss. The fang lay abandoned, a relic of victory left to be trampled underfoot. When viewed from the safety of hindsight, the scene takes on a different hue. This was not simply a matter of losing a tool, it was about the way urgency can blind even the keenest mind. Hermione was the one who often reminded Harry and Ron to think ahead, to prepare for contingencies. She carried an enchanted bag with everything they might need, from spare clothes to rare books to potions brewed in secrecy. And yet here, in the adrenaline-charged heat of battle, that same bag did not receive the one object that could rival the sword of Gryffindor in its Horcrux killing potential. Number 16, overtrusting the Ministry of Magic. Hermione Granger's unwavering faith in the Ministry of Magic during the early chapters of the Goblet of Fire was one of her rare but costly miscalculations. For years, she had treated the Ministry as the ultimate authority in the wizarding world, a place where laws were created and justice upheld without prejudice. This belief made sense for a young witch raised in the Muggle world, where official institutions were often seen as trustworthy pillars of order. Yet the signs of rot within the Ministry were already present, subtle but undeniable, and Hermione's unwillingness to question them would leave her unprepared for the political storm that followed. She had watched Cornelius Fudge handle crises with a blend of vanity and short-sightedness, but still excused his actions as the burden of leadership rather than flaws in integrity. In her mind, the Ministry's imperfections were minor blemishes on an otherwise noble institution. The Quidditch World Cup should have been her first real warning. The sudden appearance of the dark mark over the campsite sent panic through the wizarding community, and the Ministry's response was chaotic at best. Barty Crouch Sr. authorized hasty and reckless interrogations, targeting innocent bystanders like Winky without substantial evidence. "We found the elf holding the wand," became the flimsy justification for humiliation and dismissal, ignoring the absence of motive or context. Harry and Ron were quick to notice the unfairness of such treatment, but Hermione's reaction was muted. She defended the Ministry's course of action as necessary in times of emergency, unwilling to admit that prejudice against house elves had coloured the investigation from the start. Her early crusade for SPEW suggested a moral compass tuned to injustice, yet when it came to state authority, she hesitated to draw the same conclusions. By the time the Triwizard Tournament scandal erupted, the Ministry's veneer of fairness was already cracking. Harry's unexpected selection as a fourth champion raised immediate suspicion from many quarters, but instead of defending his character outright, the Ministry allowed rumours to fester. Ludo Bagman's cheerfully evasive answers and Barty Crouch Senior's rigid adherence to procedure reflected an institution more concerned with appearances than truth. Hermione clung to the belief that if the Ministry permitted Harry's name to remain in the Goblet's decision, then the rules must be binding and impartial. Her loyalty to the structure of the competition echoed her broader faith in the system that governed it, even as Harry's distress made it clear that this was not a triumph, but a trap. The Yule Ball brought a different kind of revelation. Among the visiting officials and foreign dignitaries, the Ministry's political games were on full display. Fudge mingled with journalists like Rita Skeeter, whispering in corners and shaping public narratives that would later be weaponized. Skeeter's articles twisted Harry's image and exploited personal relationships, and though Hermione bristled at the lies, she did not yet connect them to a broader pattern of manipulation allowed, if not encouraged, by the Ministry itself. The idea that the state could quietly sanction character assassination in the press was still foreign to her. To Hermione, Rita was a rogue journalist. She had not yet seen how convenient her work was for those in power. When the third task ended in Cedric Diggory's death and Harry's frantic account of Voldemort's return, the Ministry's response marked a turning point for Harry and Ron, but not immediately for Hermione. Fudge's refusal to acknowledge the truth, even in the face of Dumbledore's testimony, was shocking, but for Hermione, explainable as fear-driven denial. She told herself that the Ministry would come around once the shock subsided, still convinced that rational evidence could sway those at the helm. Harry's visible frustration at her optimism was met with a quiet, almost stubborn defense. The Ministry had kept the wizarding world safe for centuries. It could not abandon that role so easily. The following summer stripped away her illusions. By the start of Order of the Phoenix, the Ministry had shifted from passive denial to active suppression. Dolores Umbridge's appointment as Hogwarts Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher was the clearest signal yet that the institution Hermione had trusted was willing to exert political control over education. "The Ministry is determined to take a stronger hand at Hogwarts this year," Umbridge announced in her sugary, poisonous tone, masking authoritarian oversight as benevolent intervention. Even then, Hermione initially sought to navigate the new regime through compliance, reasoning that careful diplomacy might spare her friends from further trouble. This was not cowardice, but a lingering belief in reform from within. The educational decrees should have erased any lingering trust. Each new proclamation tightened the Ministry's grip, from banning unapproved student organizations to controlling the curriculum itself. Hermione's instincts as a scholar clashed with these measures, yet she still approached them with the hope that resistance could remain subtle, that outright defiance would only worsen the situation. Harry and Ron, less patient, were quicker to label Umbridge a tyrant and the Ministry complicit in her cruelty. They had moved past the point of hoping for fairness. Hermione lagged behind, not because she was blind, but because the weight of admitting betrayal by an institution she had respected was heavier for her. The tipping point came when the Ministry targeted Dumbledore's army. The organization, designed to fill the void left by Umbridge's useless teaching, became the focal point of the school's quiet rebellion. When Marietta Edgecombe betrayed the group under pressure from her mother, a Ministry employee, Hermione saw firsthand how state influence could extend into personal loyalties. The rapidity with which Umbridge acted, armed with a decree backed by Fudge's political will, made it clear that this was not the work of an overzealous individual, but the deliberate machinery of the Ministry itself. The speed, the coordination, and the shamelessness left little room for her old arguments about misunderstandings. Number 17, ignoring Neville Longbottom's help. In the cold stone corridors of Hogwarts, alliances were as valuable as any spell in the library. Neville Longbottom was not, by anyone's measure, the most gifted student in magical theory or spell precision. His wand work could be clumsy, and his memory for complex charms often faltered at the worst possible moments. Yet, time and again, he had shown a kind of bravery that did not come from skill, but from a stubborn, unshakable heart. It was the courage that made him stand in front of Harry, Ron, and Hermione in their very first year, trying to stop them from breaking the rules. It was the same courage that years later would lead him to draw the sword of Gryffindor from the Sorting Hat. Still, during much of their time together, Hermione Granger, sharp-eyed and relentless in her own strategies, often brushed aside Neville's offers to help. It was not malice, more a quiet, unspoken judgment about who was truly capable. The pattern emerged in moments that seemed small at first. During the chaos of their second year, when the school was gripped by fear of the creature in the Chamber of Secrets, Neville had approached Hermione more than once, eager to be useful. He suggested awkwardly that he might help gather ingredients for the polyjuice potion she was brewing in the girls' bathroom. Hermione thanked him, but declined, deciding instead to rely solely on herself and the two boys. "Neville means well," she later muttered to Harry, "but this needs to be done right." The unspoken implication was that Neville's presence might slow them down or lead to mistakes. Yet the irony was that her own overconfidence led to her miscalculation with the cat hair in her potion, something that could have been avoided had she allowed someone else to double-check the ingredients. By their fifth year, in the swelling resistance that became Dumbledore's army, Neville began to change. The shy boy who had once melted under Snape's glare started standing taller, speaking up during meetings. Harry noted the difference, praising his improvements in defensive spells. But when plans grew more dangerous, Hermione's instinct was still to keep the core group small. During the clandestine effort to infiltrate the Department of Mysteries, Neville was not part of the initial plan. It was only through stubborn determination that he ended up in the thick of the battle. Even then, his presence was almost an accident, not the result of being trusted from the start. The Department of Mysteries' mission would become one of the clearest examples of why underestimating Neville was a mistake. The small group, Harry, Ron, Hermione, Ginny, Luna, and eventually Neville, faced Death Eaters in a fight that spun far beyond their control. In the chaos, Hermione was knocked unconscious by a silent curse from Dolohov, and Ron was left babbling incoherently from a brain attack. It was Neville, bleeding and limping, whose loyalty and persistence kept Harry from being completely overwhelmed. "We're all still here?" Neville gasped through broken teeth, refusing to leave Harry's side even when ordered to. That night proved to everyone, including Hermione, that capability could not always be measured by spell accuracy or academic brilliance. Still, it took time for that lesson to take root. In the early months of the final battle for Hogwarts, when the trio was on the run hunting Horcruxes, Neville's name came up in discussions as an ally. He was part of the resistance inside the school, keeping the DA alive under the crushing regime of the Carrows. Yet Hermione's focus on secrecy often made her dismiss the idea of contacting him directly. She argued that too many people knowing their movements could jeopardize the mission. Harry, though, suspected part of her hesitation came from old habits, a belief that only a handful of people could truly be relied upon for delicate. This underestimation reached its quiet breaking point during one of their return trips to Hogwarts to retrieve the final Horcrux. The trio arrived under cover of darkness, slipping into the room of requirement where Neville had been organizing the hidden rebellion. He was thinner, his face marked with bruises from months of punishment, but his eyes burned with determination. It was Neville who revealed the existence of the secret passageways still open into the castle, a fact the trio had not known. His intelligence saved them hours of dangerous maneuvering. For the first time, Hermione paused, listening without rushing to correct or overrule him. It is tempting to believe that Hermione's earlier choices were the result of arrogance, but they were more complex. She carried the weight of countless decisions, knowing that a single misstep could bring disaster. In that pressure, she defaulted to what she trusted most, her own preparation and the few companions whose skills she had measured time and again. In her mind, sparing Neville from danger might have been a kindness. Yet in doing so, she denied him the chance to contribute in ways that only he could. Neville's growth during the war was not sudden but forged through small acts of defiance. He endured public humiliation from Snape without retaliation, tended to injured classmates in secret, and risked nightly punishments to spread messages of resistance. These were not glamorous acts, but they built a kind of quiet competence that Hermione had not noticed. By the time the final battle came, Neville was no longer the boy who dropped teacups in divination. He was the one who charged alone into the courtyard, the sword of Gryffindor gleaming in his hands, cutting through Nagini with a single, decisive strike. That moment was not luck. It was the result of years of courage overlooked by even his friends. Number 18. Choosing to visit Godric's Hollow at Christmas. Snow fell quietly over the thatched rooftops of Godric's Hollow, muting every sound, turning the streets into a picture-perfect Christmas Eve. Yet in that perfection lay the flaw Hermione Granger had not accounted for. In Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, her insistence on travelling to the village on that particular night was rooted in logic. She had reasoned that fewer people would be outside, that the quiet streets would help conceal their movements from watchful eyes. But reality has a way of turning logic inside out, and in this case, the silence of Christmas made them stand out more than they ever could have on a bustling weekday morning. Hermione's choice, though calculated, exposed them to a danger neither she nor Harry could fully predict until it was too late. When they apparated into the snowy square, their boots crunching on untouched drifts, the absence of movement was immediate and absolute. The war had emptied many places of joy, yet in Godric's Hollow, Christmas still seemed to draw families inside their homes, lights flickering in windows, wreaths hung with care. It was exactly this stillness that drew attention to two cloaked figures emerging from thin air. Hermione's logic had been that fewer people out meant fewer eyes, the book tells us, and yet the opposite took place. In a deserted street, every movement becomes amplified, each step feels louder, each shadow more suspicious. They had entered a place where even the smallest anomaly could not go unnoticed. Hermione's plan was born from a blend of urgency and strategy. They were hunting Horcruxes, desperate for leads, and the graveyard of Godric's Hollow was a place rich with potential clues. Bathilda Bagshot's supposed presence there was an irresistible thread to pull. The date, Christmas Eve, was chosen with the same clinical reasoning Hermione often employed in problem-solving: reduced foot traffic, diminished chance encounters, fewer Muggle witnesses. In a purely theoretical sense, she was right. But fieldwork in a war rarely bends to theory. The stillness of that night created a vacuum in which even a whisper could echo, and Death Eaters needed only the faintest ripple to find them. The irony is that Hermione had always been the cautious one, the voice urging restraint when Harry's impulses ran ahead. Yet here she was the one urging action on a date charged with symbolism and sentiment. Harry's parents had died in Godric's Hollow on this very night, 16 years earlier, an emotional undercurrent Hermione surely recognized. While she might have factored Harry's feelings into her calculations, the full emotional weight of returning to the place of his parents' deaths on Christmas Eve could not have been predicted. It's the place where it happened, Harry reflects in the book, and the poignancy of the night perhaps clouded the hard edges of their caution. Their path through the snow-laden streets took them past the war memorial that transformed into the statue of James, Lily, and baby Harry. This sight, unplanned and deeply personal, slowed them down, exposing them longer in the open square. Hermione's choice of timing had not accounted for moments of hesitation born of grief. In spy work or in survival during Voldemort's reign, hesitation was a luxury they could not afford, but the night and place conspired to pull them into reflection, making them visible for far too long in the icy stillness. The houses around them were dark except for the glow of hearth fires behind curtains. No one walked dogs, no carolers roamed the streets, no children played in the snow. It was the kind of emptiness that would normally comfort someone trying to go unnoticed, yet here it made them a moving anomaly in a frozen scene. Somewhere in that emptiness, eyes watched. The book later reveals that Nagini concealed in the form of Bathilda had been waiting, and that Voldemort himself was alerted when Harry entered her home. The Death Eaters had no need to sift through crowds. The bait had been laid in a pool of silence. When Hermione and Harry entered the graveyard, the snow muffled their steps but also amplified the absence of any other sound. Their wands lit the names on tombstones: Peveril, Dumbledore, Potter, each name drawing them deeper into the heart of the trap. It was here that Hermione's calculations began to fray. She had chosen the night for its quiet, but the same quiet isolated them, cutting off the normal background movements that might have concealed their presence. They were alone in a graveyard on Christmas Eve, two figures illuminated by wand light, framed in an otherwise unbroken darkness. Hermione's reasoning had also relied on the idea that fewer people meant fewer risks of being recognized. This held true for Muggles, but it underestimated the magical surveillance that could be in place in a village so tied to Harry's past. Magical traps do not need crowds to function. They wait silently until the right target steps into place. She was inside, waiting, the narrative tells us of Bathilda Nagini, watching from the shadows. The quiet of Christmas Eve had not removed threats. It had concentrated them. The visit to Bathilda's home was the point at which Hermione's plan unravelled completely. The stillness that had seemed an advantage now worked for their enemy. There were no interruptions, no chance encounters to break the rhythm of the trap. Inside, the air was foul, the rooms silent, except for the creaks of floorboards. Hermione's quick mind could read many dangers, but the perfect stillness here masked the most lethal one. The calendar date had done more than empty the streets. It had gifted Voldemort's agents an uninterrupted stage. When Nagini struck, the chain of events that followed was a direct result of the vulnerability created by their isolation. In a bustling village there might have been witnesses, a chance to flee into a crowd, some confusion to exploit. On Christmas Eve in Godric's Hollow there was only the cold and the snow, and the knowledge that no one would hear them scream. Voldemort's arrival was near instant, drawn by the trap's success. The snake lunged, the book recounts, and the moment of attack was the culmination of a decision made days earlier when Hermione marked the date on their mental map. In retrospect, the flaw in Hermione's plan is striking because it arose from the same qualities that so often saved them: her attention to detail, her foresight, her ability to think several steps ahead. Yet in this instance, she had misread the interplay between environment and enemy strategy. Silence can be as revealing as noise. Emptiness can spotlight as much as conceal. Her failure was not in her reasoning, but in assuming that the absence of one kind of threat meant the absence of all. The lesson embedded in this miscalculation is that war punishes overconfidence, even when that confidence is born of intellect rather than arrogance. Hermione had no illusions of invincibility, yet she trusted the logic of her choice enough to override other considerations. The Death Eaters, on the other hand, had no need to make such fine calculations. They relied on patience and traps, and on understanding that their quarry's strengths could be turned into weaknesses. The timing of the visit played directly into their hands. Harry, for his part, followed her lead without protest, trusting in her judgment, as he so often did. But the emotional pull of Godric's Hollow on Christmas Eve was as much a factor in his compliance as her logical argument. Hermione's strategy had appealed to his mind, but the symbolism of the date spoke to his heart. He wanted to be there, on that night, to stand in the place where his parents had lived and died. Logic and sentiment became intertwined, making the decision seem inevitable when, in truth, other dates might have served their mission better. Even after their narrow escape, the danger of that night lingered in Harry's thoughts. He had seen Voldemort's snake wearing the skin of someone he thought he could trust, felt the trap close around him with no one in sight to help. Hermione, too, must have reflected on the choice of timing, though the book spares her any direct admission of fault. In war, mistakes are measured not in theory but in the cost of survival, and that night had brought them perilously close to paying the highest price. The stillness of Godric's Hollow on Christmas Eve will forever stand as a moment when Hermione's perfect reasoning collided with the unpredictable reality of their enemy's cunning. The danger lay not in the plan itself, but in the single, overlooked variable that sometimes the most dangerous traps are laid in the quietest places, on the quietest nights, when the very absence of the world makes you the only thing worth noticing. Number 19, experimenting with the Firelisk's potion. In the dimly lit potions classroom of Professor Horace Slughorn, the air was thick with the scent of simmering concoctions, each cauldron emitting its own distinct aroma. Students bent over their work, some carefully measuring powdered roots, others coaxing liquids into delicate transformations. Hermione Granger, known for her meticulous preparation and encyclopedic knowledge, sat at her usual place beside Harry Potter and Ron Weasley. Her expression, however, betrayed an unusual strain of determination. That day she had set her sights on something far beyond the day's assigned work, the notoriously difficult Firelisk potion. It was a brew whispered about in advanced alchemy circles for its volatile temperament, said to produce effects as brilliant as they were dangerous, even in NE. UT-level classes, few attempted it without months of prior study. Slughorn had not assigned Firelisk to the class. In fact, its recipe was absent from the standard curriculum, tucked instead into obscure potions manuals buried deep in the restricted section. Hermione had stumbled across a mention of it in Moste Potente Potions, reading late into the night with the faint glow of her wand. The description was tantalizing, a potion capable of enhancing magical reflexes to almost preternatural speed for a short burst. It was not illegal, but it was perilously close to being banned, as its ingredients required exacting precision. One misstep could render it useless or dangerously unstable. For most students, that warning was enough. For Hermione, it was a challenge. That particular afternoon, she ignored the textbook instructions Slughorn had set for Amortentia practice, her mind buzzing with the thought of proving herself. She was already known as the brightest witch of her age, but something about the Firelisk potion beckoned to her competitive streak, especially after she had noticed Cormac McLaggen boasting loudly about brewing it under his uncle's supervision during the holidays. Hermione's jaw had tightened at his smugness, and now she was determined to show that skill did not require privilege or outside help. Her hands moved quickly but with care, slicing salamander eyes and grinding flameweed stems, her quill lying forgotten beside the open, yellowed pages of an old potions book. The first hint of trouble came as she added the phoenix ash powder. The recipe called for 3 precise pinches, stirred counterclockwise exactly 7 times between each. Her hands trembled slightly, not with fear, but with the thrill of the attempt, and she miscounted, giving the mixture an extra turn. Almost instantly, the potion's colour shifted from molten gold to an iridescent scarlet, its surface rippling as if alive. Hermione bit her lip, hoping it was merely a cosmetic quirk. The instructions did note that batches could vary in hue. She pressed on, determined to finish. Nearby, Harry kept glancing at her cauldron, uneasy about the thin tendrils of steam that curled upward, sharper and more acrid than anything else in the room. Ron whispered a comment about her secret side project, but Hermione barely heard him. The final step required adding a single drop of basilisk venom essence, a substance so rare and dangerous that Slughorn kept it under 3 separate locks. Hermione had managed to obtain a tiny vial from the professor earlier that week under the pretense of independent study. As the drop hit the bubbling mixture, a sudden hiss filled the air, like steam escaping under great pressure. The potion's surface bulged upward as if something inside was trying to break free. In that moment, she realized that the firelisk was more than a difficult recipe. It was a living, volatile thing in liquid form. Slughorn, from across the room, turned his head sharply at the unusual sound, his eyes narrowing. "Miss Granger," he called, but before she could respond, the cauldron emitted a sharp pop, sending a burst of hot vapor across the table. The wave of steam rolled toward the nearest students, causing several to jump back with startled cries. Harry instinctively shielded his eyes. Ron muttered something that sounded suspiciously like "Blimey!" as the pungent smell of scorched metal filled the room. Hermione's face flushed crimson, and she grabbed her wand, murmuring a containment charm. The cauldron shuddered, its contents fizzing angrily before settling into an uneasy simmer. For a brief, tense silence, the only sound in the classroom was the slow drip of condensation from the overhead pipes. Slughorn strode over, his expression caught between concern and exasperation. "Ambitious work, Miss Granger," he said slowly, eyeing the mixture. "But ambition in potions, my dear, must be tempered with patience." Hermione, for once, did not have a ready reply. She simply nodded, her mind already retracing every step, pinpointing the moment where pride had edged out caution. What made this lapse so striking was its contrast to her usual behavior. Hermione rarely engaged in magical recklessness. She was the one who read the fine print, who prepared a week in advance, who chided Harry and Ron for improvising. Yet here she had been, diving into one of the most temperamental brews known in the wizarding world without the extensive groundwork she normally insisted upon. It was a rare, almost humanizing error, born from a mix of rivalry, curiosity, and the relentless pressure she placed upon herself. "Even the most gifted can overreach," she admitted later, though not without a trace of defensiveness. In The Half-Blood Prince, this moment is often overshadowed by Harry's successes using Snape's annotated potions book, but it offers a revealing glimpse into Hermione's character. She was not immune to the temptation of proving herself through bold gestures. The irony was that her usual criticism of Harry's shortcuts in potions was rooted in the belief that solid preparation mattered more than improvisation. Yet in her firelisk attempt, she had taken her own kind of shortcut, not one of laziness, but of pride. She believed that her intelligence alone could compensate for lack of practice with the specific potion. It's worth noting that Firelisk was not a casual school project. According to advanced alchemical studies by Emmerich Waffling, even skilled masters occasionally abandoned it halfway due to instability. The brewing required maintaining a consistent magical aura around the cauldron, something learned only through repeated trials. Hermione, despite her aptitude, could not have built that instinct without experience. When she added that extra stir with the Phoenix ash powder, she unknowingly triggered a chain reaction that altered the potion's magical structure, turning it into a near-explosive hazard. From a narrative perspective, the scene also serves as a subtle mirror to Harry's own risky experiments. While Harry, with Snape's notes, managed to impress Slughorn effortlessly, Hermione's attempt at independent mastery nearly backfired, literally. It underscored the theme that skill in magic isn't just about raw intellect or bravery, but about the discipline to respect its limits. Hermione's setback wasn't catastrophic, but it could have been, and in that potential lay the weight of the moment. Even after Slughorn dismissed the class, the smell of the failed firelisk lingered in the air, a faint reminder of what could happen when even the most capable student reached beyond her grasp. Hermione stayed behind to scrub the scorched rim of her cauldron, her shoulders stiff. Harry didn't press her about it, though he cast her a glance that blended curiosity with concern. She knew, without anyone saying it, that her reputation for flawless execution had taken a dent that day. The perfectionist in her felt the sting keenly. Later, in the common room, she flipped through the potions manual again, eyes scanning the familiar lines with the intensity of someone looking for a personal vindication. She traced her finger over the instruction she had misread, the extra stir that had changed everything. It was not just an error, it was a reminder that knowledge without humility could lead to dangerous ground. The lesson stung, but it was one she would carry forward, even if she never admitted it aloud. In the years to come, Hermione would face greater challenges: Horcrux hunts, magical duels, the strategic demands of wartime. But in some quiet corner of her memory, she would still recall the hiss of the firelisk potion, the blinding rush of steam, and the moment she realized that even she could falter. It was not her most glorious hour, yet it was perhaps one of her most instructive. The scarlet shimmer of that unstable brew had shown her that true mastery in magic was not just about daring to attempt the impossible, but about knowing when not to. Number 20. Underestimating the power of cursed objects. When Harry first pulled the heavy Slytherin locket from his pouch, the cold metal seemed to carry more than just weight. It pulsed faintly, like a slow heartbeat, and every so often a whisper of something sharp and cruel seemed to pass through the mind of whoever held it. They had already guessed it was one of Voldemort's Horcruxes, but its true danger was far more insidious than they anticipated. Hermione, studying the strange serpent engraving and the green glow that flickered beneath the surface, had made her decision quickly. They could not destroy it yet, so someone would have to keep it safe, and to prevent suspicion or favoritism, they would take turns wearing it. It was a choice born of fairness, but it ignored a darker truth. Some objects cannot be outwilled, no matter the resolve of the person who wears them. The locket's effect was immediate on Harry. It was subtle at first, just a thread of unease tightening his thoughts. But even without realizing it, he became more irritable, quicker to assume the worst. Hermione watched, concerned, yet convinced that their rotation plan would keep its influence manageable. "It's safer if we share the burden," she reasoned. She believed their friendship, their mutual trust, would protect them. What she didn't see was that the locket was not just whispering poison into a single ear, it was seeding discord between all three of them. When it was her turn to wear it, Hermione told herself she was different. She had read more about magical artifacts than either Harry or Ron. She had memorized passages from magical hieroglyphs and logograms and secrets of the darkest art, enough to know that cursed objects thrive on fear and ignorance. She was certain her own discipline would blunt its edge. But the locket did not work like a blunt weapon. It was a slow, patient erosion of the mind. Its magic didn't just make her anxious, it found her doubts, the tiny ones she buried deep, and gave them voices. On those days, Hermione felt Ron's glances more sharply, as if he was judging her every move. She caught herself resenting Harry's silences, reading into them motives that weren't there. A single night's argument about food stretched into days of quiet tension. The locket sat cool against her skin, but in her thoughts it was always warm, as if it was alive and listening. The choice to share the burden had, in truth, ensured that all of them would suffer equally. Ron's time with the locket was the most dramatic. Even Hermione, who tried to maintain objectivity, could see the transformation in him. He grew restless, his temper shortened, and suspicion bled into his words. It was during one of Ron's turns that he accused Harry of not having a plan and Hermione of taking Harry's side against him. The locket was feeding him images, she realized later, images of betrayal and exclusion, and still they did not consider locking it away entirely. The rotation continued because they believed their rules were enough to control it. In the book, Rowling describes its influence with an understated menace. It was like having something you wanted to look away from, but couldn't. That line is a perfect reflection of the trap Hermione had underestimated. She believed she could look away, believed all three of them could, but the locket was built to keep eyes fixed upon it, to keep minds circling its dark gravity. No matter who wore it, it was never truly absent from the other's awareness. Hermione's logical mind should have considered that some curses are crafted not just to harm, but to adapt. The more they passed the locket between them, the more it learned the contours of their relationships. With Harry, it amplified guilt over those he had lost. With Ron, it stoked jealousy and feelings of inadequacy. With Hermione, it sharpened perfectionism into harsh self-criticism, making her doubt her own leadership and decisions. The sharing arrangement did not weaken it, it only broadened the battlefield. One night, when Hermione lay in her bunk with the locket resting against her collarbone, she found herself thinking of the prophecy. It was Harry's destiny, not hers, to face Voldemort. So why was she the one risking her life, day after day, sleeping in the cold, eating barely enough to survive? The thought startled her, because it was not how she truly felt. Yet the locket had planted it like a seed, and she could not easily shake it. She kept her face turned away from the fire that night, afraid Harry or Ron would see something in her expression. The danger here was not a sudden flash of dark magic or a burst of uncontrollable rage. It was the steady, corrosive drip of distrust, and Hermione's decision, though made with noble intent, had created a perfect channel for that corrosion to spread. She had underestimated the way cursed objects bypass conscious willpower. They don't try to overpower strength of mind, they slip beneath it, feeding on emotion where reason can't reach. When Ron eventually left, walking out into the darkness with anger in his voice, it was the clearest evidence that the locket's poison had worked. Hermione's voice cracked as she tried to call him back, but deep inside she wondered if this fracture could have been avoided. Had they locked the locket in a bag, far from anyone's skin, perhaps the seeds it had sown would have taken longer to sprout. Perhaps they could have kept their unity intact. But Hermione's plan had relied on an assumption that exposure in measured doses was safe. She had treated the curse like a weight that could be shared, rather than a venom that spread with each touch. Harry felt the absence of Ron like a wound. Hermione did too, though she masked it behind long hours of study and silent nights. Yet she couldn't entirely silence the nagging voice that questioned her choice. In moments of exhaustion, she replayed the first day Harry had shown her the locket. She remembered the cool glint in its surface, the way it seemed to hum faintly when held. She had taken that hum as a challenge, as if daring it to try its worst against them. That pride had blinded her to the truth that some magic isn't meant to be resisted in shifts. It's meant to be neutralized, destroyed, or avoided entirely. Even after Ron's return, the shadow of those weeks lingered. Hermione welcomed him back, but she could not help but notice the way he looked at her, as if remembering every harsh word spoken under the locket's influence. Trust, once cracked, never quite returns to its original shape. The Horcrux had left its fingerprints on all of them, and Hermione could see now that her original decision had been part of its success. She had given it direct access to each of their hearts, believing that fairness would act as a shield. The truth, as their journey went on, was that fairness is no defense against certain kinds of darkness. Voldemort had chosen the locket not only for its symbolic value as Slytherin's heirloom, but because it was an ideal vessel for paranoia and bitterness. Its magic was tuned to draw out the worst in its bearer. Hermione's failure was not one of intelligence, but of underestimating the craft of the enemy. Even the wisest can be deceived into believing they are immune. The lesson hung over them long after the locket was destroyed. Harry, in particular, remembered the way Hermione's eyes had hardened during her turns, the way Ron's voice had taken on a sharp, mocking tone, the way his own patience had worn thin to nothing. None of them were immune, not even for a day. The curse didn't break their will in a single blow. It wore it down grain by grain until it was too thin to hold. Hermione, for all her brilliance, had walked straight into that trap. In trusting her own discipline, she had forgotten that cursed objects are not simply dangerous because they are dark, but because they are clever. They do not fight strength head-on. They find the cracks, the insecurities, the hidden fears, and they work in silence until the person holding them no longer knows where those thoughts began. In the end, it wasn't the rotation that kept them safe. It was only the eventual destruction of the locket that freed them. By then, the damage was already done. Number 21. Public argument with Lavender Brown. When Ron Weasley and Lavender Brown began their brief but very public relationship in Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, it ignited a tension at Hogwarts that was impossible to ignore. For Hermione Granger, who had harboured feelings for Ron for years, the development was not just disappointing, it was humiliating. Yet instead of concealing her feelings behind her usual composure and intellect, Hermione occasionally allowed her emotions to spill over in ways that were visible to everyone. One particular flaw in her approach was her decision to make cutting remarks about Lavender in the presence of other students, a choice that spoke volumes about her state of mind and ultimately weakened her position in this silent battle for Ron's attention. In the Gryffindor common room, when Lavender was draped over Ron's arm, laughing at jokes that weren't particularly funny, Hermione's disapproval was plain. The text describes her voice as icy and her tone as cutting when she would interject into conversations where Lavender was involved. It was not a single occurrence. It happened several times over the course of the term. These comments, though perhaps satisfying in the moment, created ripples that others noticed. It was a shift from the Hermione who usually valued dignity and intellect above petty disputes to someone visibly wounded and reactive. One striking example came shortly after Christmas, when Harry walked into the common room to find Ron and Lavender nestled together, surrounded by their friends. Hermione, sitting by the fire with a book, made a loud and clearly intentional remark about people who mistake public displays of affection for actual relationships. It was not addressed to anyone in particular, but the target was obvious. The remark drew snickers from Dean Thomas and Seamus Finnegan, but also a sharp look from Ron, who immediately became defensive. This was the danger of Hermione's strategy. It did not make Ron rethink his behaviour in her favour. It pushed him to defend Lavender instead. The problem was not that Hermione disliked Lavender. That much was inevitable. But that she gave Lavender the satisfaction of knowing she had gotten under her skin. Lavender, though not particularly subtle, was perceptive enough to spot the jealousy and feed it. Every sarcastic remark Hermione made in public became fuel for Lavender's quiet sense of victory. In a setting like Hogwarts, where gossip could travel faster than a snitch, every visible sign of irritation gave Lavender an advantage. She didn't need to be cleverer than Hermione, she only needed to keep Ron's attention and let Hermione's own reactions do the rest. Hermione's strength had always been in her ability to rise above childish behaviour. She was the girl who could outthink a troll, brew polyjuice potion in a bathroom, and stand her ground against Death Eaters. Yet here, she was operating in the most treacherous battleground of all, teenage romance, and she abandoned the calm detachment that could have made her seem unshakable. Instead, her visible frustration created moments where her intelligence was overshadowed by her emotions. The sharpness of her words became the story, rather than the calm confidence that might have made her seem above the fray. There is a telling moment in the book when Harry reflects that Hermione was acting as though she had been personally insulted by the very sight of Ron and Lavender together. This wasn't just an internal observation, it was clear to other students as well. Neville Longbottom once avoided sitting between Hermione and Lavender during a heated exchange, sensing the tension. Even Ginny Weasley, who had been one of Hermione's closest allies, looked uncomfortable at the way her friend's sarcasm was beginning to sound less like wit and more like bitterness. The irony was that Hermione's intelligence should have made her aware of a simple truth. When someone is trying to provoke you, the greatest victory is in showing they cannot. Lavender was not a subtle opponent. Her displays with Ron were loud, exaggerated, and designed to be noticed. A perfectly timed silence, a small, knowing smile, or simply ignoring the spectacle, could have sent a stronger message than any remark. Silence leaves room for interpretation. Words, especially sharp ones, leave no doubt about your emotional state. Ron, for his part, was not immune to Hermione's behavior. In fact, it often made him double down. There is a passage where Ron, after overhearing one of Hermione's sarcastic comments, pulled Lavender closer and kissed her in an almost exaggerated way. This was not affection, but it was performance. Hermione's public jabs had turned Ron's relationship into a show, one that he seemed determined to flaunt whenever she was watching. The unintended consequence was that Hermione's strategy amplified the very behavior she disliked. The issue was compounded by the fact that others began to take sides, not necessarily in the romantic triangle, but in the verbal sparring. Seamus found it amusing. Parvati Patil, Lavender's best friend, openly supported Lavender, and Harry found himself awkwardly caught in the middle. The more Hermione engaged in visible remarks, the more she isolated herself socially in those moments. For someone as respected as she was academically, this shift in perception was notable. She was no longer just the clever, composed Gryffindor prefect. She was also the girl publicly feuding with another student over Ron. It is worth noting that Hermione was not entirely incapable of restraint. There were moments when she avoided comment, burying herself in books or walking away. These were the moments when she seemed most in control, and they left Lavender without material to react to. But they were too few and far between. The temptation to land a verbal blow, especially in front of an audience, was often too great. The immediate satisfaction of a cutting line was understandable, but it came at the cost of her long-term position. From a strategic point of view, Hermione's approach was the opposite of effective. In a contest for someone's attention, revealing how deeply you are affected gives the other side the upper hand. If her goal was to maintain dignity and perhaps leave Ron questioning his decisions, the better move would have been to maintain an air of unbothered confidence. In doing so, she would have remained mysterious and appealing, while also depriving Lavender of the joy of watching her react. Instead, her visible discontent became a signal that Lavender's presence was indeed a victory. There is also an element of Hermione's personality at play here that makes this behavior understandable, though not excusable. She was by nature someone who corrected others, challenged falsehoods, and refused to let something slide if she believed it was wrong. In academic or moral contexts, this made her admirable. But in the delicate arena of relationships, this tendency to set the record straight could backfire. Her barbed comments about Lavender were, in her mind, simply stating what she saw as the truth, but to others they read as jealousy. Harry himself noticed this shift, thinking that Hermione seemed less like the calm, logical voice of reason and more like someone spoiling for a fight. This was a dangerous shift in perception because it reframed her identity in the eyes of her peers. Hermione's usual command of a situation came from the fact that she rarely looked rattled. In this case, she looked rattled almost every time Lavender was near. It was an inversion of her usual power dynamic. Even years later, when fans discuss this storyline, it is clear that the core lesson is not about Ron, Lavender, or even Hermione's feelings. It is about control, the ability to manage one's reactions in a way that serves one's long-term interests. Sometimes, as the saying goes, the most powerful move is no move at all. A single sarcastic line may feel like a win in the moment, but it can reveal far more than intended, especially in a public setting. In Hermione's case, her decision to spar verbally with Lavender did little to undermine Lavender's position, and much to undermine her own. In the end, Ron and Lavender's relationship fizzled, as many suspected it would. But the road to that point was made rockier for Hermione because she allowed herself to be drawn into open conflict. The public nature of her remarks gave the impression of pettiness, which was beneath her usual standards. It stands as one of the few moments in the series where Hermione's quick wit, normally her greatest asset, worked against her. By engaging openly, she not only signaled her emotional vulnerability, but also gave her rival the satisfaction of knowing she mattered. Silence, in this case, could have been her greatest ally. Number 22. Neglecting magical creatures in the forest. The winter forest pressed in around them, its skeletal branches clawing at the pale sky, the ground beneath their boots frozen and treacherous. Harry's breath fogged in the brittle air, and beside him Hermione trudged on, her eyes darting left and right with the cautious, almost paranoid vigilance that had become second nature since their flight from Godric's Hollow. They had been on the run for weeks now, moving from one remote patch of wilderness to another, their tent pitched in lonely hollows, their wands always within reach. The forest they now crossed was ancient and strange, thick with the scent of pine and something older still, something that didn't belong entirely to the human world. Harry noticed it first, a pattern in the snow, delicate yet unmistakable. Hoofprints, large and deep, each one set with an unhurried, almost regal precision. They curved away into the undergrowth, disappearing into shadow. It was the kind of sign that might have sparked curiosity in a less desperate time. But Hermione's expression hardened as soon as she saw them. She bent to inspect the nearest print, her gloved fingers brushing over the rim of compressed snow. "Too big for deer," she murmured, almost to herself, before standing abruptly and scanning the trees. Harry felt the hairs on the back of his neck stir. He remembered Firenze in the Forbidden Forest years ago, the silver light of the moon falling on the centaur's proud, inscrutable face. It wasn't impossible. They could be close. But Hermione's lips pressed into a thin line and she shook her head. "We can't risk it," she said sharply, though there was no one to argue. She turned away, leading them deeper into the forest and away from the prince, leaving the silent path to vanish under the falling snow. The decision seemed small in the moment, one of dozens they made each day in the name of safety. Yet Harry couldn't help but think about it later when the cold bit deeper and the shadows seemed thicker. Centaurs were not the enemy. In fact, their neutrality had always been more complicated than the Ministry liked to admit. Firenze himself had once defied his own herd to protect Harry, to deliver warnings that no wizard would have given. The hoofprints they had passed might have belonged to him, or to another who shared his sympathies. But Hermione's mind was locked in a pattern. Anything unknown was dangerous, and anything dangerous was to be avoided. It was a strategy that had kept them alive, but also one that quietly severed potential lifelines. Days later, when they sat huddled in the tent, Harry recalled how the forest had fallen into unnatural silence just before they'd spotted the prince. A faint rustle in the distance, a whisper of movement that might have been wind or something more deliberate. In the Deathly Hallows, the moment was described with deceptive simplicity. They passed without speaking, leaving behind them only the sound of their own footsteps in the snow. It was a sentence easy to skim past, but heavy with implication. Silence in a wild place was rarely harmless. Something had been watching them, perhaps assessing, perhaps waiting. Hermione's caution was rooted in bitter experience. They had been betrayed before, by people who seemed trustworthy, by situations that looked safe until they turned lethal. Her instinct was to close every door before it could be used against them. But the forest was not the same as the political web of the Ministry or the chaos of the Death Eater regime. Magical creatures had their own codes, their own loyalties. The centaurs in particular valued their independence fiercely. They neither served Voldemort nor welcomed interference from wizards. To ignore their presence entirely was to forfeit an ancient potential ally. Harry thought of the Battle of Hogwarts, still far in the future but already inevitable in those bleak days. He remembered how the centaurs had ultimately charged from the forest, arrows flying, turning the tide in moments when hope was nearly gone. They had not done it for Dumbledore's army, nor for the Ministry, but because the battle had spilled into their territory, and they had chosen to act. What might have happened if contact had been made earlier, Could they have been persuaded to lend support, or at least to share information about the movements of snatchers and Death Eaters in the surrounding countryside? These were the questions Harry would never be able to answer because Hermione had chosen the safest path, the path that kept them alone. Hermione's decision was not just about the centaurs. The same cold, careful logic led her to ignore other signs during their wandering, claw marks on a tree trunk that might have belonged to a werewolf or might have been left by a protective, magical guardian, a flicker of movement across a stream that vanished before they could identify it, a haunting series of low calls at night that echoed through the bare branches. She categorized each one in the same mental ledger: unverified, therefore unsafe; unsafe, therefore irrelevant. It was the kind of risk assessment any strategist would admire, but in the messy, unpredictable world they now inhabited, the line between threat and opportunity was blurred almost beyond recognition. In the books, Hermione's role often involves knowledge as a weapon: the right spell, the right historical detail, the right book plucked from the library's shelves. In the wilderness, that knowledge was still valuable, but it was bounded by her willingness to apply it. "It's not worth it," she told Harry, when he hesitated over the hoofprints. "Even if they mean well, they might give us away without realizing it." The logic was sound. But by treating every unknown as a trap, she effectively closed the door to any alliance not already vetted. In the forest, information was as precious as food or fire, and sometimes it came from unexpected places or creatures. There was also the question of moral responsibility. Centaurs were not tools to be used, but beings with their own agency. Ignoring them entirely might have been intended as respect for their privacy, yet it also stripped them of the chance to choose. Firenze had once told Harry, "The forest holds many secrets. Some are worth knowing." That truth cut both ways. Perhaps the centaurs had something worth sharing, something that could have lightened the burden Harry and Hermione carried. Walking past those hoofprints without even trying was, in its own quiet way, a dismissal. Later, when Ron rejoined them and they compared stories, he listened to the account of the forest and frowned. Ron had grown up with tales of magical creatures that roamed the British countryside, and while his instincts were less academic than Hermione's, they were attuned to the value of unexpected allies. "If they were centaurs, they might have known things," he said. Harry didn't respond, but the thought lodged itself deeper. They were starved for reliable intelligence in those days, reduced to guessing and waiting. One conversation, one exchange of trust, might have shifted their odds. The hoofprints faded from memory for a time, overshadowed by the constant grind of survival. Yet when Harry looked back on their months in hiding, he saw them clearly. A fork in the road that had been passed over without discussion. It was a reminder that choices made in the name of safety can have invisible costs, costs that might only reveal themselves in hindsight. Hermione's leadership during those months was invaluable. Her meticulous planning kept them alive through cold, hunger, and the constant threat of discovery. But her habit of filtering every encounter through the narrowest definition of safety meant they walked alone through a world where isolation was as dangerous as exposure. In that sense, the hoofprints in the snow became a symbol of a broader truth about their journey. They were fugitives in a land thick with potential friends and enemies, and the difference between the two was not always clear until it was too late. Hermione's refusal to engage was born of reason, but it also reflected the limits of reason in a landscape shaped by instinct, tradition, and chance. The centaurs, proud and inscrutable, would never know how close they came to meeting the boy who lived in the depths of that winter forest, and Harry would never know what might have come of it. The snow that day was falling lightly, muting the world into shades of grey and white. Each step forward erased the one behind, the trail closing almost as soon as it was made. In the hush of the forest, The hoofprints had seemed like a message written for anyone who knew how to read it. Hermione's decision to walk away did not feel dramatic at the time. It felt like a precaution, a simple refusal to complicate an already dangerous journey. But sometimes the smallest refusals carry the largest echoes. When Harry remembered the moment years later after the war, it was with a mixture of understanding and regret. He knew why she had done it. He also knew that the war had been a tapestry of small moments, each one threading into the next, creating patterns invisible until the whole picture was seen. In that picture, the hoofprints remained, faint but enduring, a reminder that in the wild places of the world, danger and salvation often walk the same path, and that to turn away from one is inevitably to turn away from the other. Number 23, reading Secret Magic at the wrong time. The cold air of the forest was still, the kind of oppressive quiet that makes even the crackle of a fire sound too loud. Harry sat near the edge of the clearing, his wand resting loosely in his hand, eyes darting into the shadows. Ron was pacing, muttering under his breath about food, about how long they'd been camping, about the way everything seemed to be falling apart. Hermione, however, was not looking outward at all. She sat cross-legged by the tent, her back to the darkness, her face lit by the pale yellow glow of lumos as she held open a thick, cracked-spined book. The gilt letters on the cover had long since faded, but the embossed words were still faintly visible. Secret magic, rites, and incantations of the old age. She had found it weeks earlier, wedged between other forgotten tomes in a dusty shelf inside Bathilda Bagshot's cottage before the chaos broke out. The pages smelled of mildew and ash, but the content, it was irresistible to her. She had explained, in her brisk, matter-of-fact way, that some of these spells might not be found anywhere else. "It's knowledge, Harry." "Knowledge is power," she had once told him, almost quoting her own instincts rather than anyone else. But on this night, with the fire casting long, flickering shadows, her eyes were buried in a passage about the ancient practice of Idonis binding, a charm so obscure that even the margins held cramped notes from some forgotten scholar. The tension in the air had been growing for days. They were being hunted. Snape knew their every likely move, and the Death Eaters had set wards across the countryside. A smart mind would have divided its attention, half on the present, half on the book. But Hermione's hunger for knowledge had always been absolute. Her hands clutched the pages as though they might vanish, and she traced each line as if memorizing every rune and annotation. The fire hissed when a log collapsed inward, yet she didn't flinch or look up. Harry, uneasy, glanced at her more than once. He remembered how Mad-Eye Moody had once growled that constant vigilance was the first rule of staying alive. At that moment, Hermione had none. The warning signs were subtle at first. A faint distortion at the edge of the clearing, like a shimmer of hot air though the night was frigid. Harry noticed it because he had been scanning for precisely this kind of anomaly. He sat straighter, his fingers tightening on his wand, but by the time he opened his mouth to speak, the shimmer had expanded into a ghostly web of pale blue light. It clung to the trees like frost, creeping closer in a slow, predatory advance. He had read about such magic only once, in Lupin's Defense Against the Dark Arts lessons, a tracking veil, a spell the Death Eaters used to mark territory and locate their prey. It was rare and dangerous because it didn't require the caster's presence. Once activated, it moved like a living thing. Ron saw it too and froze, his earlier complaints vanishing. The veil had already spread halfway across the clearing, and in its wake the night sounds died. Harry turned toward Hermione to warn her, but she was still hunched over the book, her lips moving silently as she read a particularly dense section on the ceremonial uses of obsidian. He felt a jolt of anger mixed with panic. She hadn't seen it. She hadn't seen any of it. The shimmer reached the edge of the firelight, and the blue glow briefly illuminated Hermione's face. Her eyes were locked on the page, where the script described an invocation of Ashen Cloak, a defensive charm so old it was thought to predate wands. Later, Harry would recall the absurdity of it. She was reading about defensive magic while entirely unprotected in the present moment. Ron stepped forward, his mouth opening, but the web suddenly pulsed, as though sensing them, and a low hum filled the air. That hum was the first real warning Hermione heard. Her head snapped up, the book still open in her hands. For a heartbeat, she looked confused, as if she had been dragged out of another world entirely. Harry shouted her name, pointing toward the veil, and in that instant she understood. The book fell shut with a heavy thud, the light from her wand extinguished. She leapt to her feet, her voice sharp as she began chanting a shielding spell, but the veil had already begun curling inward like smoke, its tendrils reaching for the ground. Harry would never forget the way her expression changed, guilt flickering in her eyes even as she raised her wand to counter the encroaching magic. She knew she had lost precious seconds. A jet of silver light burst from her wand, striking the nearest arc of the veil. It shuddered, recoiled, and then split into fragments that scattered like shards of glass. But it was not gone. It was only slowed. Somewhere in the distance, a faint echo of voices drifted toward them. The Death Eaters had felt the resistance in their trap. They moved quickly then. Harry doused the fire with a hiss of steam. Ron began dismantling the tent with shaking hands, and Hermione continued to fight the veil's advance. Each counterspell bought them only moments, but those moments mattered. Even the best spell is useless if you cast it too late, Harry would later think bitterly. That night, it felt like they were seconds away from being caught. The forest seemed to press in on them as they fled, every shadow a possible pursuer. By the time they had put a mile between themselves and the clearing, the hum of the veil had faded. They stopped in a narrow hollow beneath overhanging roots, their breath misting in the cold air. Hermione still clutched the old book, though now it was pressed tightly against her chest, as if it were something dangerous rather than precious. Her cheeks were pale, her eyes fixed on the ground. No one spoke for a long time. The only sound was the ragged rhythm of their breathing. Later, when they made camp again far from the forest, Harry saw her sit apart from them, the book lying closed beside her. She didn't open it that night. He thought about saying something about how dangerous her distraction had been, but the words felt heavy in his throat. He remembered the passage she had been reading, the strange, looping diagrams and archaic phrases. Some part of him understood her. Hermione believed in preparation, in gathering every scrap of information that might help them. But there was a difference between preparation and obsession, and in that clearing she had crossed the line. Ron wasn't as quiet. The next day, his muttering carried an edge that had nothing to do with food or the Horcrux around his neck. Harry caught fragments. Could have been the end of us, all for a bloody book. Yet Hermione said nothing in response. Instead, she kept her eyes on the path ahead, the weight of the book still in her bag. It wasn't until days later that she carefully tore a strip of parchment from its end papers and wrote in her neat hand, "Do not open when watch is yours." Harry noticed the note when she reached for the book one evening, and he wondered if it was for her, or for him and Ron, or for some future reader who might repeat her mistake. That mistake was not just about distraction, it was about timing. The secret magic text was, without doubt, valuable. The spellwork it contained could be the difference between life and death in the right moment. But the wrong moment, as they had all learned, could be just as lethal. Harry remembered a line from one of Dumbledore's speeches at the DA meetings. Decisions in magic are rarely about what you can do. They are about when you choose to do it. Hermione had always been brilliant at the first part. That night proved she still had something to learn about the second. Even weeks later, when the episode had blurred into the relentless rhythm of their hunt for Horcruxes, the image returned to Harry at odd moments, the blue shimmer of the veil against the firelight, the way Hermione's eyes had been so deep in the page she might as well have been miles away. Knowledge had nearly cost them everything, not because it was dangerous in itself, but because it had been embraced without awareness of the present. In war, as in magic, there was no such thing as a harmless distraction. And though no one spoke of it again, the lesson lingered. Hermione never again read during her watch, no matter how tempting the text, no matter how ancient or rare the magic within. The old book remained in her bag, its cracked spine wrapped in a protective charm, its secrets locked away until the time was right. That night in the forest had taught her, in a way no lecture could, that the most useful spell in the world is worthless if your enemy finds you before you can cast it. Number 24. Giving Harry a broken wand in the Chamber of Secrets. In the dim corridors of the Chamber of Secrets, where the smell of damp stone clung to every breath, a single object could have meant the difference between survival and disaster. That object was a wand, not just any wand, but the battered, treacherous wand that had once belonged to Ron Weasley. It had been split nearly in two during the violent crash into the Whomping Willow earlier that year, and though Ron had stubbornly tried to mend it with spellotape, the damage was irreparable. Every student at Hogwarts knew it was unreliable. It sometimes sputtered, sometimes exploded, and often backfired with a comic cruelty that left its owner scorched or coughing. And yet, in the chaos of that final rescue mission beneath the school, it somehow ended up in Harry Potter's hand, courtesy of Hermione Granger, she who was known for her meticulousness, her refusal to leave anything to chance, and her uncanny ability to anticipate danger. The memory of that wand's earlier betrayals was not vague or distant. It was fresh. Only months before, in Professor Lockhart's disastrous defense against the dark arts class, the broken wand had turned a simple Rictus Sempra into a deafening bang that nearly singed Ron's eyebrows off. The pages of Chamber of Secrets recall vividly that the wand had given a loud bang and shot backwards out of Ron's hand, hitting him hard in the stomach. In another instance, during the Dueling Club demonstration, it had backfired with a pitiful puff of smoke, leaving its owner defenseless. Hermione had been present for each humiliation, watching with equal measures of sympathy and disapproval. She knew better than anyone that this wand was more hazard than tool. And yet, in the frantic rush to save Ginny Weasley from whatever horror lay in the chamber, Hermione made a choice that jars on reflection. When events forced Harry to arm himself quickly, she handed over the first wand she could reach, Ron's. It was an uncharacteristic lapse for the girl whose school bag contained spare quills, backup parchment, and sometimes even supplementary books for classes she was not enrolled in. This was Hermione Granger, who had brewed Polyjuice Potion in a deserted bathroom, who had memorized the rules for every restricted section book she had borrowed, who had lectured Harry on the dangers of flying a car to Hogwarts. And yet this time, her attention to detail faltered at precisely the wrong moment. Perhaps it was the adrenaline. The basilisk was somewhere below, a living weapon from Salazar Slytherin's era. Ginny's life was slipping away with each minute. Professor Lockhart, smug and treacherous, was on the verge of desertion. In such circumstances, even the sharpest mind could falter. But the result of that falter was profound. A broken wand in the hands of the boy who lived, in a confrontation where precision and power were essential, was like handing a soldier a rifle with no bullets. Worse, it was like handing him one that might explode in his hands. Every spell Harry attempted with that wand could have been his last. There is a certain irony here that the narrative of Chamber of Secrets quietly brushes past. Hermione had, throughout the year, chastised Harry and Ron for their impulsiveness. She had warned them about their carelessness, their habit of rushing headlong into danger without proper preparation. Honestly, don't you too ever think things through? She had scolded more than once. And yet, in this instance, it was her own lack of forethought that set the stage for the potential disaster. There is a subtle reminder here that even the brightest witch of her age could be undone by the speed of events. The danger was not hypothetical. Earlier in the year, Ron's broken wand had turned a simple "eat slugs" hex against Draco Malfoy into a revolting self-inflicted punishment. The wand had backfired, the text reads, and Ron was doubled over, belching out large, slimy slugs into the grass. This was not an isolated quirk. It was the wand's defining trait. For Hermione to forget this, if forget is even the right word, is astonishing. It suggests that in the tension of that moment, her mind was focused entirely on speed rather than the long game, an approach that was entirely alien to her usual methods. From a tactical perspective, Hermione's action could have been catastrophic. In the chamber itself, Harry's survival hinged on precise wand work. Whether it was summoning Gryffindor's sword from the Sorting Hat or defending himself against the basilisk, each spell was a thread in the web of his survival. If the wand had failed at the wrong moment, if it had shattered in his grip or turned a defensive spell back upon him, the legend of Harry Potter might have ended in those underground tunnels. We would be speaking of a boy who fell in his second year, felled not by Voldemort directly, but by a preventable lapse in judgment. Some might argue that Hermione simply had no other choice. Wands are personal instruments, attuned to their owners, and Ron's was the only spare immediately available. But this defense rings hollow when weighed against her character. Hermione was not one to hand over dangerous tools without a word of warning. Even a single breath to remind Harry, "Careful, it's damaged," could have changed the tone of the scene. Yet the book gives us no such caution. The transfer is silent, unremarked, a fleeting detail in the chaos, and perhaps it is that very silence that makes it so troubling, for it means Hermione herself may not have recognized the enormity of the risk she was creating. One could imagine an alternate unfolding of the events in the chamber. Suppose Harry, in desperation, had cast a defensive spell as the basilisk lunged, only for Ron's wand to explode in his hands. The blast could have left him disarmed, injured, and unable to protect himself. Without Fawkes's timely arrival, without the sword, without any functioning magic, the basilisk would have won. The wizarding world would have lost its symbol of hope in the darkness, and all because of a single overlooked detail. In the broader scope of the series, this lapse serves as a reminder that even heroes are flawed. Hermione's brilliance is unquestionable. Her role in Harry's victories is immense, yet she is not infallible. This is the same girl who once set a teacher on fire in a moment of panic, who brewed Polyjuice Potion without fully testing its safety, who believed that a time-turner could be used for academic purposes without consequence. Her choices, while often guided by logic, were not immune to the distortions of urgency and emotion, and in the Chamber of Secrets, urgency won. It is also worth noting the thematic weight of the broken wand itself. Throughout the book, Ron's faulty wand is a symbol of vulnerability. It underscores the Weasley family's financial struggles, the imperfections that contrast sharply with the gleaming privilege of other wizarding families. Every failure of the wand is a small humiliation, and yet in this climactic moment that same instrument becomes a potential agent of fatal error. Hermione, in handing it to Harry, unconsciously carried forward the motif of imperfection into the most dangerous arena of all. From a narrative standpoint, J.K. Rowling seems to use this moment not to highlight Hermione's misstep, but to quietly allow it to pass, buried under the drama of the rescue. Readers are swept into the battle with the basilisk, the horror of Ginny's still form, the echoing voice of Tom Riddle. Only in hindsight does the fragility of Harry's magical defense come into sharp relief. This is one of those instances where the reader, on a reread, feels the chill of what could have been. It is tempting to imagine Hermione's own thoughts had she reflected later on this choice. She was, after all, petrified for much of the climactic sequence and did not witness the events in the chamber firsthand. But when Ron and Harry recounted their adventure, surely the detail of the wand emerged. Would she have flushed with embarrassment? Would she have replayed the moment in her mind, realizing too late the risk she had introduced? The Hermione we know would not have taken such an oversight lightly. The scene also invites a broader question about the relationship between intelligence and judgment under pressure. Hermione's intelligence was unmatched among her peers, but intelligence alone does not always yield flawless decision-making. In life-threatening scenarios, even the most brilliant mind can default to the quickest solution, bypassing the careful weighing of options that defines them in calmer moments. The broken wand in Harry's hand is a perfect emblem of that trade-off: speed over certainty, immediacy over safety. In the end, luck and intervention saved Harry from the consequences of that moment. The Phoenix's tears, the sudden availability of Gryffindor's sword, and Harry's own courage closed the gap that Hermione's lapse had opened. But the fact remains. Her action, however unintentional, introduced a risk that could have cost everything. It is a rare, humbling reminder that even the most careful among us can falter, and that sometimes the greatest dangers are not born from malice, but from the smallest, quietest oversights. Number 25. Distrusting Luna Lovegood. The snow was falling gently over the grounds of Hogwarts, muffling the sounds of hurried footsteps. Harry Potter remembered that winter evening vividly, not because of the weather, but because of what almost happened. The trio, Harry, Ron, and Hermione, had been moving quickly along the darkened corridors after an urgent meeting of Dumbledore's army. Luna Lovegood had been with them earlier, her wide eyes even more distant than usual, her gaze flicking toward the windows as though she could see something no one else could. "They're here," she had whispered, in that dreamy voice of hers, referring to the Death Eaters. But Hermione, adjusting her scarf tightly around her neck, had dismissed it, with a brisk shake of her head, muttering that Luna's mind was full of nargles again. At that moment, it seemed like a harmless dismissal. In hindsight, it was almost a costly mistake. Hermione Granger had always prided herself on her logical mind. She relied on evidence, on verifiable facts, and on the written word more than anything else. Luna's strange observations about creatures no one had heard of or conspiracies that seemed far-fetched often clashed with that mindset. Hermione had once told Harry that seeing things that aren't there doesn't make them real. And while she never intended to insult Luna, her skepticism was clear. It wasn't that Hermione disliked her, it was that she couldn't reconcile Luna's unprovable insights with her own rigorous view of the world. Yet on that winter night, Luna's unprovable insight was the only warning they had. The DA meeting had ended later than planned, and most of the group had dispersed toward their respective dormitories. Luna had lingered, her gaze fixed on the snow through the glass, murmuring about shadows moving where shadows shouldn't be. Hermione had been in the middle of discussing a charms essay with Harry when Luna quietly mentioned that she felt a pressure in the air, like the silent hum before a storm. It was the kind of statement Hermione would normally brush off as poetic nonsense, and she did. But Harry noticed a flicker of unease in Luna's expression, something that didn't fit with her usual detached calm. They had reached the corner near the statue of Boris the Bewildered when it happened. A faint thud echoed from somewhere beyond the corridor, followed by a soft metallic clink. Harry froze. Ron instinctively moved closer to him, hand reaching for his wand. Hermione frowned, clearly torn between dismissing it as a trick of acoustics and acknowledging that it was indeed strange. It was only when the muffled sound of boots crunching on snow reached them, distinct, deliberate, that Harry's instincts screamed at him. Death Eaters, he thought immediately, recalling Mad-Eye Moody's warning that they could infiltrate Hogwarts under certain circumstances. Later, Harry would realize that Luna had tried to tell them. When pressed about it, she simply said, "I saw them." Not clearly, just outlines in the snow, people who shouldn't be there. She had seen their shapes against the whiteness, faint and flickering like candlelight through frosted glass. She hadn't needed hard evidence. She had trusted her intuition, but Hermione had not, and that moment of hesitation could have left them exposed. What made this incident so striking was not just that Luna had been right, but that Hermione's refusal to consider her warning almost placed them in danger. In the chaos that followed, they narrowly avoided crossing paths with the intruders, thanks to Harry's quick decision to lead them through a hidden passage behind a tapestry. As they slipped into the narrow, dust-filled space, Hermione's lips pressed into a tight line. She did not speak, but her eyes betrayed the conflict within her. Logic had failed her here, not because it was wrong, but because it wasn't flexible enough to account for what couldn't be proven. The irony was sharp. Hermione, who had read more about magical defenses and counter-curses than anyone her age, had overlooked the possibility that truth might come wrapped in eccentricity. Luna's history of strange remarks had created a pattern in Hermione's mind. Odd statement equals falsehood. It was a neat equation that had served her well in most situations. But here, it had been dangerously misleading. Luna's ability to see connections others missed, to notice shifts in atmosphere or details in the periphery, was a kind of intelligence that didn't fit into the categories Hermione valued most. One could argue that this wasn't the first time Luna had been dismissed, only to be proven correct. Harry recalled the Department of Mysteries, where her insight into the Thestrals had bridged a gap in understanding for him. Luna had explained, in her quiet way, that things we lose have a way of coming back to us in the end, and while at the time it seemed whimsical, it had resonated deeply after Sirius's death. She had a way of touching the truth from a sideways angle, and that was precisely what made her warnings so easy to ignore. Hermione's distrust that night could also be traced to the way she compartmentalized information. Facts went in one box, feelings in another, and unverified statements in a locked drawer labeled nonsense. It was a habit born of her Muggle upbringing, where magic did not exist and proof was the only currency of truth. Luna, raised in an environment where belief was fluid and unseen things were given space to exist, operated in the opposite way. For her, the lack of proof was not a barrier, it was an invitation to keep looking. The events of that night were over in minutes, the Death Eaters, realizing they had been spotted by someone, perhaps even by Luna herself, melted into the darkness beyond the castle. Harry and the others emerged from the hidden passage only after Filch's grumbling echoed through the corridors, signaling that the coast was clear. Ron muttered something about mental luck, but Harry suspected it had been more than luck. Luna's attention to what others would dismiss had steered them away from danger before they even knew it was there. In the days that followed, Hermione avoided direct discussion of the incident with Luna. She thanked her, in a roundabout way, during a meeting of the DA, commending everyone who kept an eye out for unusual activity. It was a small acknowledgement, but Harry noticed Luna's serene smile when she heard it. Hermione wasn't ready to admit she'd been wrong outright, but the shift in her tone suggested she had filed this event away under exceptions to the rule. What makes this moment worth examining is how it reveals a subtle flaw in Hermione's otherwise brilliant character. Her intelligence was unquestionable, her bravery proven time and again. But her skepticism, while often an asset, could also blind her to unconventional truths. In the war against Voldemort, where deception was the norm and information came in unpredictable forms, the ability to entertain unlikely possibilities was not just useful, it was essential. This incident also underscored a larger theme that ran quietly through their adventures, that knowledge takes many forms, and not all of them are bound in books. Dumbledore himself had said, "It is our choices, Harry, that show what we truly are, far more than our abilities." Choices about whom to trust, even when their words seem strange, are part of that truth. Hermione's choice that night had been to trust her framework over Luna's instinct. It had almost cost them. It was a reminder that sometimes the most valuable warnings come wrapped in eccentric packaging. Harry often wondered if Hermione thought about that night afterward. She never brought it up again, but he noticed she grew quieter when Luna spoke in her peculiar way. She listened more, interrupted less. Perhaps she had learned that even the most unlikely observer could hold a piece of the puzzle. In a world where Death Eaters could hide under cloaks of invisibility and the most dangerous magic left no visible trace, dismissing an unorthodox perspective could be a form of self-sabotage. Luna, for her part, never seemed to hold Hermione's skepticism against her. That was her nature, unshakably gentle, even toward those who doubted her. She continued to speak her truths, whether or not anyone believed them. In her mind, seeing what others missed was not a talent to be defended, it was simply who she was. And on that snowy night, it had been the difference between walking blindly into danger and slipping quietly past it. For all Hermione's brilliance, it was Luna's strange, unprovable warning that had kept them safe. Number 26. Refusing the life-giving potion in the Deathly Hallows. When the trio was wandering through the cold, barren countryside in Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, their every step felt heavier under the weight of hunger, fear, and exhaustion. They had been living on tinned soup, stale bread, and whatever mushrooms Harry could find near the riverbanks. Every night, the tent became a prison of shivering bodies and faint embers that barely warmed their hands. The wind outside sounded like a constant reminder of their vulnerability. It was in one of those lonely, forgotten villages that they encountered an elderly woman who carried in her frail hands a glass phial filled with a pale, shimmering liquid. She called it living water, claiming it could restore energy, fend off the cold, and heal the fatigue in their bones. The liquid seemed to glow faintly as though holding its own breath of life. In that moment, it was as if the universe itself had extended a rare kindness. Hermione's face, however, hardened with suspicion. She eyed the phial not with wonder but with calculation, as if weighing the odds between salvation and betrayal. The old woman's voice, trembling with age, explained that the water came from a hidden spring, deep in the hills, known only to those who had lived in the village for generations. But Hermione's mind was already barricaded behind the possibility of treachery. She thanked the woman briefly and refused, moving quickly on. It was a decision that Harry and Ron would not fully understand at the time. Harry's stomach tightened with disappointment, and Ron's eyes lingered on the glowing liquid, as if memorizing the chance they had just lost. Later, in the suffocating silence of the tent, the cold seemed even sharper. Hermione's reasoning was rooted in caution, and no one could deny that the times demanded it. They were fugitives, hunted not only by Death Eaters but also by anyone desperate enough to betray them for a handful of gold or a promise of safety. In her mind, the phial could have been poisoned, cursed, or enchanted to track them. The war had already shown her that danger often came dressed in the most harmless disguises. Yet in this particular case, the missed opportunity was striking. She had at her disposal a range of simple detection spells: Specialis Revelio, to identify enchantments, Scourgify and Aguamenti, to test purity, or even a conjured glass to examine the liquid in controlled conditions. A few careful charms could have determined whether the old woman's gift was genuine or dangerous. Instead, the moment passed, and with it a potential lifeline. That night, as frost crept along the edges of the tent canvas, Ron's teeth chattered so violently he could barely speak. Harry lay awake, his body aching from the relentless cold, replaying the scene in the village. He thought of the pale shimmer of the living water, the way it seemed to pulse faintly, as if promising warmth. He remembered the way the old woman's hands had trembled, not with malice, but with the strain of holding something precious for too long. In the moonlight, it had looked like a piece of the dawn itself, caught and bottled. The refusal now felt like a wound. In their journey, resources were not just useful, they were survival itself. The difference between finding the strength to press on or collapsing from exhaustion could lie in moments like that. From a tactical perspective, Hermione's choice can be seen as overly rigid. While her fear of a trap was not unfounded, the complete dismissal of the offer without investigation contradicted her usual methodical approach. In previous years, Hermione had been the first to consult books, conduct experiments, and examine evidence before forming conclusions. She had once spent weeks researching Polyjuice Potion before brewing it in their second year, a process far more dangerous than testing an offered phial. Yet here, in the midst of the most desperate phase of their mission, she chose avoidance over analysis. Perhaps the constant pressure of leadership, for in many ways she was the one guiding their survival, had narrowed her judgment. Ron, ever more instinctive and less analytical, took the refusal personally. He saw the decision not only as a rejection of the water, but as a rejection of hope. To him, the war was already stripping away their comforts one by one, and here was Hermione pushing away what little was left. The journey was not simply about destroying Horcruxes. It was about enduring until they could, and enduring required moments of relief, however small. Even a mouthful might have made a difference, he thought bitterly as the wind sliced through the tent seams. In later arguments, this memory became one of many unspoken resentments that quietly built between them. The living water's true nature remained a mystery, but its description in the woman's words hinted at something powerful. Folklore among wizarding villages spoke of springs infused with traces of phoenix tears, said to grant resilience against exhaustion and illness. In the tales of Beedle the Bard, there is even a brief mention of a draught so pure it carried the echo of the first dawn. While this may have been myth, their desperate situation made it worth testing. The refusal highlighted the tension between theory and practicality. The cleverest witch of her age overlooked a real-world advantage in favor of theoretical safety. Hermione herself may have felt the sting of the decision afterward, though she never admitted it openly. Her caution had kept them alive countless times, from avoiding suspicious strangers to meticulously casting protective enchantments around their campsites. Yet this victory of safety over sustenance came at a cost. The human body, especially one under stress, cannot endure prolonged deprivation without consequence. Over the following days, all three grew paler, weaker, and slower. The cold settled into their bones, and their tempers frayed more easily. Even Hermione, who often buried herself in maps and planning to ignore hunger, seemed slower in her speech. In the broader scope of their journey, this episode reflected the delicate balance between trust and paranoia in wartime. Every encounter was a gamble. Yet history in the wizarding world offered examples where small acts of trust had led to great victories. During the First War against Voldemort, members of the Order of the Phoenix had relied on the secret aid of sympathetic shopkeepers, innkeepers, and wanderers. Rejecting every offer of help risked cutting off the few remaining lifelines. By refusing without inquiry, Hermione had, in effect, closed a door that might never open again. Harry, who had seen firsthand the value of unexpected allies, from Dobby's intervention at Malfoy Manor to Aberforth Dumbledore's discreet support, could not help but wonder if the old woman's gift had been one of those rare moments when the universe placed the right thing in their path. He didn't voice his doubt partly out of respect for Hermione's leadership, but partly because hope itself had become dangerous. To long for what might have been was to risk despair. The memory of the village lingered for weeks. When they later found themselves trapped in a particularly bitter snowstorm, Ron muttered under his breath about what a mouthful of that water might have done. Hermione ignored him, but the flicker in her eyes betrayed a trace of regret. She may have replayed the scene in her own mind, the way the phial had caught the weak winter light, the way the woman's smile had been patient, almost knowing. Yet by then, the decision was locked in the past, and survival demanded focus on the present. In moments of great stress, even the most rational minds can become prisoners of habit. Hermione's default in dangerous situations was to trust research and verification before action, but in the wilderness with no books or library to consult, this instinct translated into inaction. Ironically, the very intelligence that often saved them may have prevented her from taking a calculated risk that could have improved their odds. War demands adaptability, and in that cold village square, adaptability might have meant bending her rules. There is also an emotional undercurrent to consider. The trio's encounters with strangers during their journey had often been dangerous or deceptive, reinforcing Hermione's reluctance. From the suspicious behaviour of Xenophilius Lovegood to the betrayal at the hands of Mundungus Fletcher, the line between friend and foe had blurred almost to invisibility. Each disappointment made her walls higher. To lower them, even for a moment, would require more than a faint glow in a bottle. It would require the luxury of trust, which they no longer possessed. The living water episode serves as a quiet but telling example of how war shapes decision-making. In peacetime, Hermione would have tested the file, documented her findings, and perhaps even written to the Department of Magical Law Enforcement about its properties. In war, she weighed the risk and walked away. And while that choice likely spared them from one kind of danger, it also deprived them of an opportunity for strength. Every decision carried a shadow, and this one lingered longer than most. Even after Voldemort's fall, Harry sometimes wondered about that moment. In the haze of victory celebrations and the long, slow rebuilding of the wizarding world, there was no way to find the old woman or the spring she spoke of. The phial of living water existed now only as a what-if, a glimmer of something they would never know. Perhaps it was poison, perhaps it was salvation. But in that winter, under the oppressive weight of frost and fear, the refusal carved a quiet lesson into their story, that survival is not only about avoiding death, but about recognizing when life is reaching out to you, even through the hands of a stranger. Number 27. Leaving Borgin and Burkes without investigating. The bell above the crooked door of Borgin and Burkes had barely stopped rattling when Hermione Granger made her decision. The air in the shop was thick, heavy with the scent of dust and something metallic, as if old curses still lingered between the shelves. A glass case glittered faintly with the dim reflection of the grimy street outside, while in the far corner Draco Malfoy stood with his back partially turned, his pale fingers hovering over a strange object. The place was silent, except for the faint creak of floorboards under the shopkeeper's weight. Harry Potter and Ron Weasley lingered near the door, their breath catching as they watched Malfoy lean closer to whatever had caught his attention. Yet before their eyes could adjust, before curiosity could lead them deeper, Hermione tugged on their sleeves and whispered that they had to leave immediately. Her urgency was real, almost tangible. In her mind, the risk of being discovered outweighed the gain of learning what Malfoy was up to. The shop's owner, Mr. Borgin, had a sly, watchful expression that could slip into suspicion at any moment. Hermione knew Malfoy would not hesitate to report seeing them in a place like this, especially if he realized they were following him. Her voice trembled slightly when she reminded the boys that Knockturn Alley was not Diagon Alley. Here, everyone had secrets to guard, and strangers were rarely welcome. The moment they stepped into the street, the oppressive gloom of the shop gave way to cold grey light outside, and she exhaled as if they had just avoided a catastrophe. But the decision, swift and absolute, came at a cost. Harry had caught only a fleeting glimpse of Malfoy's hand, pale against the dark wood of the counter, pointing to something Borgin seemed unwilling to touch without gloves. That moment was gone the second Hermione pulled them away. "We shouldn't be here," she said, her eyes darting from shadow to shadow, convinced that every doorway held a potential threat. In her mind, leaving meant safety. Yet by stepping away, she left behind a mystery that might have been the key to understanding Malfoy's behavior during that strange summer. The very shop they had abandoned was no ordinary store. Borgin and Burkes was infamous even among wizards for dealing in cursed objects, dark magical artifacts, and relics steeped in sinister history. In Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, Rowling described it as a dingy, windowless shop full of dark objects, its cases and cabinets holding items like the Hand of Glory and cursed necklaces. Each object was a potential weapon or a tool for sinister work, and Malfoy's presence there was far from innocent. Harry would later be certain that the item Draco examined was part of a larger plan involving Death Eaters, but in that moment the opportunity to confirm his suspicion slipped away.